Hello and welcome to the Superposition Guys podcast. My name is Yuval, and my guest today is Michele Mosca, founder, president, and CEO at EvolutionQ, a quantum-safe cybersecurity company. Michele and I talk about post-quantum cryptography and quantum key distribution, the timeline for hardening a company's infrastructure, standards organizations, and much more. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, Michele, and thanks for joining me today.
Hello, Yuval. It's great to be here.
So who are you and what do you do?
I'm Michele Mosca. I'm a mathematician by training. I lead the quantum-safe cybersecurity company EvolutionQ. I'm involved in a number of other activities building up the quantum and quantum-safe ecosystem and maintain an affiliation at the Institute for Quantum Computing of the University of Waterloo, which I helped found many years ago.
So I think we all owe a big thanks to Professor Shor for his algorithm, because that raised the awareness of quantum and the risks that quantum has for cybersecurity. How does your company help address these risks, and in what time frame?
Yeah. So our company started off several years ago helping this because there's several stages to getting your systems to be resilient to quantum-enabled attacks. We need that to be in place in order to reap all the positive benefits of quantum computing that your company and other companies around the world are working toward helping everyone realize. But for that to really happen without very serious collateral damage, to put it mildly, we must first get everyone, or at least the major digital platforms, to be sufficiently resilient to quantum attacks. But that's on a one-step process. So years ago, we started off with the first stage, which is really awareness, right? And then the second stage, we pioneered what's known as a quantum risk assessment to help people internalize, what does this really mean to us? How would this impact us? What are sort of the high order terms? What are the most serious problems we need to start addressing and when? And then the third phase is starting to actually do something, coming up with a roadmap, a plan, engaging with the vendor ecosystem, testing solutions, and so on, and piloting things, and preparing. So your last dress rehearsal before you're in the final stage, which is now I've deployed, quantum safe solutions in my various digital platforms. And so the first 2 to 3 stages are professional services. And what we discovered as we were doing these professional services for people over many years is we found a gap. And the gap was the following. So the first layer of defense is to protect against quantum-enabled attacks is just a plug-in, well, in quotes, what one might at least conceptually look at as a plug-in replacement for the existing mathematical algorithms that enable HTTPS and secure browsing and all these other things. And that's a long and hard process that we've been actively engaged in for many years. And that's largely been a part of our services. In fact, I helped launch an open source platform to make it easier for people to benchmark and test these solutions in their system, so we can kind of be ready for the day where we really, really need to deploy these things because the attacks are really imminent or actually happening. But we can't just go back to the status quo, right? In the 90s, if public key cryptography was broken, it would have been a bad day. Okay, understatement, but it wouldn't have been an existential threat, right? The economy wouldn't have collapsed. Lives, it wouldn't have been. There wasn't a massive safety issue associated with cryptography, but now there is, right? Now we have. It's not just IT, but it's also OT, cyber physical systems, and so on and so on. And guess what? It's going to keep getting the dependency on digital platforms and their cybersecurity, therefore, is continuing to increase as we go to 5G, 6G, this machine to machine, and so on. The stakes just keep getting higher. So we can't just accept the chance that these new codes could be broken. And a lot of these, at least 2 of the codes currently under consideration, ended up being broken. Maybe they can be fixed, maybe they can't. But if they're deployed in production systems and they're broken, you don't get to hit the pause button, right? So there's a lot we need to do to make our systems more resilient. A lot of that includes, just more agility, make it faster to switch from one code to another, put in some extra layers. But there's also a role for, especially for the most critical systems, to have a key that isn't dependent, that isn't susceptible to mathematical cryptanalysis. And that's where quantum cryptography and quantum communication networks, which continue to improve. So I say QKD is a solution that ages really well, or as technology advances, the advantage really goes to the defender in this case, because you can deploy better and better QKD systems. What was missing when we were looking at this was a easy, scalable, convincing way to take QKD from sort of a point-to-point solution, a very hardware-centered solution, to one that is really something you could deploy across an enterprise and not worry about the details of the hardware. So we developed sort of a vendor-agnostic framework where you could kind of interoperate many different vendors, right, and do it in a very scalable way. So that's what our product called BaseJump. It's a quantum delivery network. So we coined that term because the idea is it's a framework. It's a tool for delivering quantum safe keys, securely, rapidly, robustly to endpoints on demand. So they can have that extra layer of assurance against cryptanalysis of sort of the more conventional methods.
So if I'm a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, sounds like the assessment of my risk would take 2 minutes, because you say, well, you're using systems today that could be broken with a quantum attack. So you need to do something quickly for the systems that are, at least for those that are most important for you. How long does it take to harden an organization to secure some of their systems? Is that a multi-year process? Is there a band-aid that you're suggesting right now and a better one in 2 years?
Yeah, great point. Because that's often the perception is that, well, what's there to assess? So the risk assessment looks at all the different ways. So first of all, it takes time to even find. People don't have an inventory of what cryptography they're using. So it is a pretty sophisticated process at the end of the day, where you have to see the vulnerabilities, figure out how they can actually be exploited, start ranking the vulnerabilities in terms of likelihood and impact, and then have a prioritized approach in terms of which systems you really need to protect against quantum-enabled attacks by when, right? So you do have to have a prioritized list. You really want this system protected by this year and this system by that year. And then there's the nice to haves and the systems that'll get, they'll get secure when they get secure. But what are the high order terms? Because, and the second part of your question really is the critical point. It takes many years to migrate these things. So you do have to prioritize, and you do have to get started in time. And how long it takes, well, that can vary. In a test system, you could do it in a matter of weeks, but in any real world system, it takes years to migrate for many different reasons. For one, there's dependencies, right? Again, it really depends on the system, but most real world systems, it's not where there's one company, that's the client and the server, and where all the users use whatever operating system that they tell them to, right? So it's complicated when you're trying to take a legacy platform and migrate to a very new tool with different requirements. But it can take anywhere from 5 to 15 years to properly migrate a system. Now, people might say, well, can't you just try harder and go faster? A little bit, but there is a fundamental speed limit at which you can change something so complicated with so many different stakeholders in a secure way. You want it to be certifiable, and we don't even have the certification framework set up, right? That alone will take years, right? You can't just have everyone saying, hey, we've quantum proofed it, trust me, right? We need those frameworks to be set up, and we're working on all these things in parallel at this point, because otherwise we won't be ready, or at least we likely won't be ready in time. That can take quite a number of years, and the essential thing is to get started. I guess the one last point I wanted to make on this, if you try to break that fundamental speed limit, then what happens? There'll be tremendous costs that do not require quantum attackers, right? So then even if the quantum attackers don't come after you, first of all, your systems will crash simply because you rushed the migration, right? You didn't give people time to do the upgrades they needed to do. You will make mistakes, right? Systems go down because of a software update that didn't go as planned. Imagine if you're doing something as fundamental and ubiquitous as this in a rushed manner. So there's no cyber attackers even. That's just self-inflicted wounds because you created a crisis where that was avoidable. But then there's also additional cyber risk in that when you rush to the deployment of any software, but especially cryptography and cybersecurity tools, you're going to make mistakes in the design and the implementation. And cyber attackers love that. That's their bread and butter. It's not typically sophisticated cryptanalytic attacks. It's exploiting mistakes that have been made and user mistakes and so on. So if we try to rush this migration, it's a wonderful day for cyber criminals. And they're already kind of winning the war. So the last thing we need to do is to give them yet another huge advantage.
How does this work end to end? I mean, right now I'm using a Mac, and let's say I'm connecting to my bank. So I have sort of a regular encryption protocol in place. And then the bank may be connecting to some other bank, and maybe in a couple of years that will be a quantum secure link. But do you think I'll get a quantum key on my Mac in a couple of years, or is it just the backbone that's going to be more secure?
In the short term and even the medium term, we're really talking about the backbone that is where there's QKD keys, sort of delivered at the base level. But there are certainly enhancements we can do even at the last mile to take it up a notch or two beyond sort of the vanilla flavored end-to-end post-quantum. I'm a big believer in the vanilla flavored end-to-end post-quantum because at some level, the best security is the security you use. Because remember, the cheapest and easiest thing is to do nothing. And in many of our communications, much of our communications, we don't encrypt, we don't authenticate, and we make a risk decision. But the next thing you want is what's the easiest non-trivial defense I can deploy as ubiquitously and robustly as possible, so people don't find it as a nuisance and aren't working around it, right? And that's kind of post-quantum cryptography plays a beautiful role there. It provides us some great protection, and it's beautiful end to end, right? And then you're going to go one layer down and protect even more. The whole point of a quantum delivery network is to make this higher level of assurance, this extra layer of assurance, easier to deploy and scale. But indeed, as you say, that's going to connect certain basic nodes or hubs, and then you still have sort of that last mile of protection, which is if it's just the last mile, then it's a much easier proposition to deploy some of these higher assurance methods that don't require quantum.
And as it relates to your company, to the extent you're willing to tell me, do you primarily sell services like the assessment, or is the bulk of revenue coming from product like the distribution network that you mentioned?
So we're going to be transitioning now, right? So up until now, it's been largely services, and we're going to the services part will grow, but the revenue from the base jump licensing will, over the next small number of years, overtake that.
Recently,
but we're going to keep both. I mean, we're going to keep helping with the services, but it's the deployment of the solution that's going to become the bigger part of our company.
Recently, NIST, National Institute of Standards of Technology, made an announcement about the four, initial protocols that they want to use. My question to you is, first, how close is it to a working standard? And two, does that become a global standard, or is there going to be similar work that's going to happen at the EU and other places before it becomes a worldwide secure network?
Yeah. Sorry, what was the first part of the question?
How mature are these the NIST
Yeah.
standards? How close are they to being a real standard?
Well, they're going to be a real standard by around 2024, right? How ready are they for real world showtime? I think we're in the Goldilocks zone. So some people say it's too soon, it needs more time. Other people say we needed this, a few years ago. So there's no perfect time because everyone has a different risk tolerance, different migration time. So there's no perfect. So I think it's going to be pretty robust. But that's why at the end of the day, you need years of deployment in real world systems to further build up confidence in these systems. So the sooner you start, the sooner you'll build up that confidence, right? And furthermore, there's going to be the next phase of this confidence building when quantum computers are actually here. Because so we can battle test the implementation, right? Interoperability and sort of a lot of those real world issues now. We can battle test resilience against classical attacks now. So that's again, the sooner we start, the sooner we can get that done and build up that confidence. But there's still the confidence against quantum attacks that will remain until we've had large scale quantum computers for several years. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, that's partly why, for one, why we continue to advocate to keep deploying the battle tested, hardened, current methods for key agreement and signatures. And of course, once quantum computers are mainstream, those provide limited protection, right? Because then it's not going to be free to launch quantum attacks. So they still offer some, they're still making it a nuisance. But that's why you want additional layer of defense, such as what QKD can offer. So there's no, the fantasy is we have a code where we have a guarantee that it's secure and it's cheap and it's easy, but that's just not the way the real world's going to play out. But we're still in a pretty good place where we have codes we have pretty good confidence in, and we're going to continue to build up confidence. And we have mechanisms for mitigating the residual risk. So we just need to be proactive as a society, right? Internalize these risks, the costs, and properly manage them. In terms of is every jurisdiction going to have its own standards? We generally hope not, right? I think for much of the world, NIST has an open process, and we tend to adopt the NIST algorithms, right? But then there's other standards built on top of that, because that's just it's not like the NIST standards are completed and we're done. Then there's financial standards on top of that, and there's standards for how you use the cryptography and all sorts of different systems. And that's where ETSI and other standards organizations and ISO and so on, there's going to be risk management standards, and there's a lots of other standards around the core cryptographic algorithms, where again NIST is I think the foremost authoritative body there. Again, it's a USA based, but there's many of the algorithms have come out of Belgium, right? So it's definitely international in how it engages people. That said, the German government has proceeded to standardize some algorithms before, because remember I said the Goldilocks zone, some people needed it sooner. Well, the German government felt it needed some algorithms. They needed something, it couldn't wait, just its risk tolerance. So it's standardizing some out. Now, these are not out of left field. These are algorithms that were part of the NIST process, but aren't necessarily on the NIST finalist list. That doesn't mean they'll never be standardized by NIST, but it just means in the short term, the German government is standardizing them. But it's all, I think, done in a collegial, collaborative way, where all of society benefits. Now, there are parts of the world that may not want to adopt the NIST standards. But again, I hope as a global society, we get to a place where we can agree on a fundamental, simple and secure way to send zeros and ones across the planet and compete at higher levels in the stack. But China's pursuing its own process. The fundamental machinery is very similar, but it wouldn't be surprising that they develop their own standards, and then there's going to be a bit of extra work getting all these different platforms to work in these different jurisdictions. But I'm not expecting a plethora of different jurisdictions. You might remember in the 90s, you'd travel around the world, you needed 3 chips to have, be able to make calls in Japan or, in other parts of the world. So it's not like this is a totally new thing. Well, this is actually a much simpler problem to solve if at the end of the day there's 2 standards we need to manage. But it'd be nice if we could agree on one or some common suite of standards.
As we get closer to the end of our conversation today, you mentioned that to get these standards in place, I'm sure there needs to be collaboration between governments and private companies like yours. Do you think governments are doing too much or too little or just right to get to where we need to be?
So far, I would say they're not doing too much. Too little is, they could do more, and maybe they will start to do more. Ultimately, they need to, you have to be careful what you wish for. They need to help internalize the cyber risk that is just being accepted without, due consideration. Because ultimately, we don't have seatbelts in cars because of the market forces, right? There was regulatory requirements that said, look, we're going to save lives if we require seatbelts. And so they were required, and speed limits and driver's licenses. It wasn't market forces that created those. So with cybersecurity, there has to be a regulatory push to properly internalize, the costs of not properly securing things. But the answer isn't to be prescriptive, right? So that's why maybe you didn't want governments to come in too soon and start prescribing to people what to do. There's many reasons why that's a bad idea, but we do need governments to start, encouraging with this, in a non-prescriptive way, accountability. They do need to start requiring their critical infrastructures, the critical infrastructures we all depend on for our livelihood and our safety, to have a proper plan to protect against this emerging threat, right? So I think governments do have a role to play in properly internalizing that. And they also have a role to play, a little more subtle, to make sure the global markets in cryptography and cybersecurity function properly. So they can't be too nationalistic to the point where your only market is your domestic market, because then there won't be enough money in the system to develop the high grade products we need. So we do need an appropriate regime for using each other's products and services, so we can have really high quality products protecting our digital platforms. Those are 2 examples of where they're going to need to do more. I'm not saying it in the sense of, well, they've been slackers not doing their job, but now that the world's evolving, that is kind of the next phase where we need governments around the world to step up.
And my next to last question is, so if I'm a CISO of a large regional bank, what should I do today? What should I do tomorrow morning?
So if you haven't already, and you really need to make sure that there is somebody in charge, and this is their number one job, not something they do in their spare time. This is their number one accountability. This is what their KPI should be based on. And it's to make sure there's a proper quantum readiness plan at your organization. It starts off with one person, but it probably needs to grow. And again, this needs to be their job, and they need to be set up for success, which means they need not just the CISO support, but they need cross-functional support at the organization to make sure they get access to the risk managers and everyone else they need to talk to start formulating, to do their assessment, start formulating their plan, and then growing the team, and so getting the investments they need to properly transition the platform. They'll need to engage people outside of the bank, but it's a balance, right? You can't outsource this kind of accountability. You need somebody on the inside who really understands the business, driving things, but you can't also recreate everything that has been created on the outside. So you need to properly engage, but you need to know what questions to ask, right? And how to interpret the answers, and then know what to do next. So you need a balance of, you need a core team, starts off as one, but quickly grows, driving this transition for your organization, and is engaging more and more with the vendor ecosystem, so they know what tools and services to procure to affect the necessary migration.
So, Michele, how can people get in touch with you to learn more about your work?
Probably the easiest way is just to find me on LinkedIn and send me a note there. Yeah, Michele Mosca.
That's perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure, Yuval. Take care.